Well, welcome again to day 5 of the 15th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment. I'm Bob Hales, I'm your moderator. Uh, don't forget, we've got one more session during the noon hour today with the Wall Street Journal folks. If you have an opportunity just to drop by for a few minutes, it'd be great for them and for me. We have with us today Melissa, is it Shetler?
That is correct. Good job. Not everybody gets it right.
uh, she is an assistant professor in the teacher education program at William Penn University in Iowa. Makes sense. She was an elementary teacher for 9 years before shifting to higher ed, and you survived quite well. Uh, So today's session she's going to talk to us about is let's get engaged with cooperative learning structures. Melissa, let me turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, Bob. Just like you said, my name is Melissa Shetler. I had a quick little slide about a little background about me, but I think you kind of hit on those main points. But I do like to emphasize this a little bit because I think it helps kind of create some understanding of why I teach the way I do. So, like Bob said, I started as an elementary educator. I taught in first through fifth grades over 9 years, never all at the same time, different grades over different years. So I've got a pretty wide experience of what it looks like to work with young students, and got my master's several years ago and had this, I always had a passion for teaching. I was that kid in kindergarten that I knew I was going to be a teacher. And I have an 11-year-old daughter now that she's getting to that age where she's starting to think about different careers and what she wants to do with her life and dream about those things. And she says to me, Mom, if you couldn't teach, like if it wasn't even an option, what would you do? And I stare at her and I'm like, I don't know. I would make a career out of cuddling babies. Like that's all I would do. That would be my next step would be I'll just cuddle babies. So I really feel like I was born to teach. It's always been a passion of mine. And after being in the elementary classroom for several years, I just kind of got to this place where I wanted to make a bigger impact on the world of teaching. And it just so happened my husband's job relocated us to a different part of Iowa, and a position opened up at this teeny tiny college, William Penn. And even though I grew up an hour and a half away, never heard of it because it was just this little college. And I lived in a big college town with a state college where, my radar was always on the University of Iowa Hawkeyes, and applied, and I have not looked back. I love it. I've been here for about 5 years, and I do teach in the teacher preparation program. So I teach future teachers. I oftentimes get questions like, so what do you teach at William Penn? And I say, well, I teach in the education department. And they're like, isn't all college education? It is. I teach future teachers. So I think that's important to understand about me, because a lot of what I do with my students now is modeling what I did in the classroom as an elementary teacher, because I really want them to have the best model possible for them to go out into the classroom themselves. But with that being said, I also think that it creates a much more engaging environment in my classroom. And a lot of the things that I'm going to show you today are things that really can be utilized in many different types of classrooms, different types of settings, just to increase that engagement in the classroom. All right, so our goals today, we're going to define cooperative learning. Some of you probably have a solid understanding or a good background, at least, of what that means. So we'll just kind of create a nice, clear definition. We will identify 4 cooperative learning structures. And then I'm also going to give you some implementation ideas and suggestions so that you kind of know, like, these are my tips and tricks based on many years of doing this with not only little kids, but big kids in college. So we're going to be a little bit interactive today. I'm going to have you take a minute here, just about 1 minute. You can jot it down on a piece of paper or bring up a Google Doc or whatever on your computer. And I want you to think about this. What is your current understanding and experience with cooperative learning? And I'm going to go ahead and mute myself just for about a minute to give you some time to reflect on that.
They're slow typists.
Yeah, you can type it in the chat box if you want, or you can just jot it down on your own. Either one's totally fine. But I see Bob's Bob's response there. Nada. I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds. Again, if you want to put it in the chat box, you're welcome to, but certainly don't need to. All right, and then bringing that to a close, again, if you're kind of still writing, feel free to continue that as you're listening. So stepping back for a minute, let's build up a little bit of this background knowledge that's kind of helpful to understand what it is that we're going to do today. At the very basic level, we have three forms of learning. We have that independent learning, which is learning on your own. That's a lot of what higher education learning looks like. We have competitive learning, where we're learning against others. And then we have this last piece, which is our cooperative learning, learning with others. And then similarly, we have three basic forms of student engagement. We have that cognitive engagement. So these are our students who try to learn as much as possible. They're really thinking about the content. They might ask a lot of questions and they're processing it deeply. It's not always easy to observe that with students because it is an internal process. Then we have that emotional engagement. This is where a lot of my students fall. You know, they're students that they love school, so they want to be teachers. So they like school. They have a positive outlook on learning experiences. And then lastly, we have this behavioral engagement. So this is that active participation in your learning experiences. This is where when you go into a classroom and you see things happening, you can physically see and observe that learning. That is your behavioral engagement. And that's where I really try to create a lot of learning experiences for my students. And so we're going to look at this kind of intersection between cooperative learning, where we're learning with others, and that behavioral engagement, and using cooperative learning as an avenue to increase the behavioral engagement in your classroom. So you might be asking, like, why is this important today, right? So Johnson & Johnson, they're kind of leaders with research on cooperative learning. In 2014, they had an article in which they said cooperative learning resulted in, quote, higher level reasons, more frequent generation of new ideas and solutions, and greater transfer of what is learned with one situation to another than did competitive or individualistic learning. So we're really getting a bigger bang for our buck with cooperative learning. And again, that's one of those things that I'm always telling my students, okay, there's so many different teaching strategies out there. There's different programs and ways to do things. There's tech tools. What are the things that can give you the biggest bang for your buck? And cooperative learning is really one of those. But again, it creates more behavioral engagement in your classroom as well. So there's tons of engagement with it anyways. So I see in the chat box there, we've got some kind of general comments about what cooperative learning is: working together toward a common goal, interdependence, increased practice, group student-centered. So lots of really key pieces there for sure. I like to give kind of a very approachable definition of cooperative learning. You can find all kinds of them that are big and bulky, but a very approachable one, in my opinion, is instructional structures or protocols where students are working together, generally in small groups, to achieve a common goal. And I'll define that idea of structures and protocols a little further for you as well. But what we have here are students working together, generally in a small group. Usually I do 3 to 5 students. And then, yes, they are working for a common goal of some sort, but it's more organized than just having students work in a group. And that's where that instructional structure or protocol comes into play. So what are those structures or protocols? I'll use both words interchangeably, and you'll see them in the literature and things like that as well. These are explicit steps students follow. So for example, we'll talk about a turn and talk. It could just be a very casual, like, turn and talk to your neighbor, or we could structure it a little bit more so that it's more structured, essentially. You might have rules defined. So a timekeeper, a facilitator, the person who shares out, things like that. That is not something that I heavily rely on, but it might be something you utilize. The biggest thing is that it creates organization within a group, and through that organization, it leads to more equal sharing. So if we think about all of our learners on this big, long continuum, right? At one end, we have those learners that are our leaders, they're our go-getters, they are our doers and get things done. They are the great students that we can rely on. However, sometimes those students, when they're required to do group work, just say, I'll just do the project and I'll email it to you when I'm done. So they do all of the work sometimes, right? I'm guilty of being that person in the past, okay? And then at the very far other end of that continuum, we have our students who love to just fly under the radar if they can. They'll take care of it. I don't need a little bit more accountability, and it limits that opportunity for that, big, strong go-getter leader to just do all the work. So when we think about cooperative learning, kind of at the highest level, there are 5 essential criteria that we would want to have met to say, yep, this is authentic, genuine cooperative learning. And they are positive interdependence. So this is basically that idea that the success of one person depends on the success of the group. So we need to collectively work together here. But then there's also that piece of individual accountability. So everybody has some amount of accountability for the role that they play in this activity. We also have that face-to-face promotive interaction. So this is our students that are, again, interacting in a face-to-face environment. I also will give you some ideas for what that might look like via Zoom, but they're constructively encouraging, motivating, and supporting one another. We have those collaborative interpersonal skills. So some of our students have those natural collaborative interpersonal skills built in. Some need to work a little harder to employ them or build them up. And then lastly, we have this aspect of group processing where we're processing all of that material together. Now, again, this is what the literature says is authentic cooperative learning. Most of the time in my classroom, all or most of these things are happening, but not all the time. I'm going to be very honest. So while this might be kind of the high level of what you're achieving or working towards, I don't think it needs to be the only goal when you're thinking about implementing cooperative learning in your classroom. So my proposal, and I share this like across higher ed, coming from somebody who was born to be a teacher, that my experience first is purely teaching and not academics. Let's just make some small shifts, right? Small shifts break up that instruction. Predominantly throughout higher ed, lecture is still the preferred avenue for delivering our content. And while sometimes we have content that it's just the nature of it requires a lecture, I think there are opportunities to break it up and provide opportunities for students to kind of collaboratively process that material together. Now, while most of my classes that I teach are more hands-on, lots of methods to teaching classes and things like that, I do have some that just the nature of what it is that I'm teaching is delivered primarily through a lecture format. But I make some intentional changes here and there to break up that instruction. So we know that, our attention spans only last for roughly 10 to 15 minutes. And thinking about most college level schedules, you might be in a class for 60 minutes or 90 minutes, depending on the schedule. So really being intentional about every 10 to 15 minutes, breaking it up so that students have an opportunity to kind of process what it is that you're spewing to them via your lecture, process it together. And again, why do we want to do this? I say, obviously, because it does increase that behavioral engagement in the classroom by physically doing something rather than sitting back and listening. So our students who are listening to a lecture might look engaged because they're watching the slideshow, they're awake. They might be thinking about lunch. They might be going through their to-do list for the day. They might be daydreaming about any number of things. They might be fully disengaged by scrolling on their phone. They might have their computer open to trick you, make you think they're taking notes, but they're just completing the assignment for the next class that they're going to. So if we can use some of these structures to break up our instruction, we can really increase that engagement in our classroom. And then it provides opportunities for most, or at least hopefully all, students to discuss the content. And I believe that's really important because sometimes we don't realize what it is that we do or do not fully understand until we are engaging in dialogue around that content. So having students discuss it allows them to decide, okay, how well do I know this? And now I can better identify what questions do I have? And I can ask my instructor while I'm here in class before I leave to go start my assignment that matches this content for the day. So we're going to do kind of go through 4 structures today: turn and talk, a new favorite one of mine called Microlab. Jigsaw is a pretty common one that a lot of people know, and then mix, pair, share. With each of these, I'm going to give you kind of exactly how I structure it in my classroom so that it's like very clear expectations. Like my students know exactly what to do. And then we'll also provide some ideas of how to implement them. So I want to take a quick moment. If you could put in the chat box, if you have utilized any of these or have any familiarity with any of these 4 cooperative learning structures, you can just pop in the chat box any of them that you do know or are familiar with. Awesome. Turn and talk and jigsaw. Awesome. I'll wait just a few more seconds. Okay. Everything but Microlab. Awesome. Turn and talk and jigsaw. Great. So again, a lot of this is going to be familiar to you. Hopefully you still have something to take away from it that is, another way to implement it, another way to make it a little bit more structured. So we started with that reflection, that what is your current understanding of and experience with cooperative learning? If we were physically together in the classroom, I would first have students reflect on something and do it in writing. So I always have my students write first. And so I think that kind of connects into that individual accountability piece. And it gives everybody an opportunity to genuinely think about it before they get into a group where they're engaging with that information. So I always start with an independent reflection first, and I always have students write it down. Very occasionally, I'll say, I just want you to think about this for a minute, and then we're going to talk. I would do that more so with classes that I know are just highly engaged in general with content that they don't need a whole lot of kind of push from me to get engaged. But in general, I'll have them write first. So everybody gets a chance to write, and then the other piece is I can see when those pencils are going, and when those pencils start slowing down, I know we're kind of at the end of our thinking that we need. I might just give you a minute or two. I might say, oh, that was quick. That was 30 seconds. Let's go ahead and move on. Sometimes I think I'm going to give them a minute, and 4 minutes later, they're still just like writing away. And I'm like, I'm going to give you the time because you've got a lot of thoughts to put down on paper. So having them write allows you to kind of monitor when students are actually ready to move past just that reflection piece and move into actually engaging it with their peers. So in a turn and talk, I have students stand up and I have them find a partner with somebody new who they haven't talked to yet today. At a very low level, you can just say, hey, turn and talk to your elbow buddy. But what do our students do? They typically come in and they sit down, a lot of them in the same seats, with the people that they are familiar with, their friends, people that they're comfortable with. And so if we only have them talk to those same people, their perspectives aren't going to be well-rounded for what the whole class thinks. So that's where I have students find somebody new who you haven't talked to yet today. Then give them 2 to 3 minutes to share, depending on, again, what that prompt was. It might be shorter, it might be longer. And again, this is a piece where I always structure it a little bit more. Who's going to share first? The person with the most pets is going to share first. The person whose birthday is closest to today. The person who's the tallest. The person who's the oldest. Anything like that. I'll throw out all kinds of random things. And then it provides an opportunity for those students to have a quick conversation and get to know each other a little bit more, which then sometimes kind of cuts down on that feeling of, this is a really risky situation for me if I'm not a very extroverted person. So person with the most pets will share out, and then I will have them return to their seats when signaled to do so. That last piece, sometimes I say when you're done sharing and both people share, then head back to your seat, and I'll kind of monitor based on how groups are going. Or I might just kind of wait until that conversation starts to die down. Then I'm going to cue them all back together. Thank your partner, have a seat. So turn and talk is a very, very easy one. And this is one that I implement in the class that I have kind of most lecture in. Every about 10 to 15 minutes, what would be time-wise in my slides, I have some sort of turn and talk prompt. And that prompt is always something about the content, right? So what is it that you have questions about? What did I just teach you? What is the biggest takeaway you've had so far in class today? I might even start class with this. What's one thing from last class that you learned? What was your most important takeaway from last Wednesday? Anything like that. So what might this look like in an online format? So I teach, most of my teaching is face-to-face, but I do teach in our distance learning class or our distance learning format as well. So that is live on Zoom in a format like this. So I would have students, okay, I'm going to put you in groups of 2 in the breakout rooms, and I'm going to give you just 2 minutes. Put you in the breakout room, you're going to talk for 2 minutes, and then you're going to come back. One thing that if you use Zoom, but you're not super familiar, in breakout rooms, you can set a timer, and whatever time you put, it'll always give the students 1 more minute to come back. So a lot of times what I'll do, if I want them in there for just 2 minutes, I'll say, I'm going to set the timer for 1 minute. You'll get a notification saying there's 1 minute left. And at that time, they can either leave the room or they can stay. And I tell them, I want you to stay in the room until it kicks you back. So you get 2 minutes and then everybody's coming back at the same time rather than like a minute of people kind of trickling in. And then it gives them, because you're there for 2 minutes and you get a 1 minute warning, they know, oh, our time's about halfway up, we better get going. So that's one way to use that in an online format that does work really well. So like I said, I use this a lot to break up long sections of content or lectures. So one of my classes, again, it's just the nature of the content, it is very lecture heavy. And so every 10 to 15 minutes or so, I have some sort of prompt. I'll give students some time to write, have them stand up, find somebody they haven't talked to today, talk about that, and then head back to their seats. Inevitably, I always get more questions when I do that than if I just say, what questions do you have? Because then they're required to first write. So they're really having to think about it. What is it that I actually understand? And what is it that I don't understand? Then they're talking about it with a partner, which sometimes leads to, oh, I thought it was this. You said something totally different. We need clarity. And so it's a really great way to not only allow students to have some really in-depth processing of that content while breaking it up so that they're kind of waking up a little bit, but also kind of reveals any sort of misconceptions or questions, gaps that need to be filled. I like to start it too with previous classes. So what's one thing from the last class, or here's a prompt that we went over last week. I want you to think about it, and we're going to start with that. And that honestly was some feedback I got from my students. I teach an 8:15 a.m. class in the fall on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, which, we know is nobody's favorite time to show up for class. And several of my students said, I love when you make us do this, even if I don't want to. I like it because it makes me get up and move and wake up a little bit more when I'm really tired. And I think it'd be a great idea if you started class with that every day, just a quick review. And I was like, that's great feedback, great idea. I've implemented it and it's worked really well. I also utilize this as a way to emphasize key concepts. So I go through some information and there's something that I really want to make sure you take away. I am going to make sure you have time to talk about it and process it together with your group, okay? So the next one is the microlab structure. So I think this is the one that most of you said you are not familiar with. This is one of my new favorite ones, and I just discovered it. You can see the sources at the bottom, and I meant to bring the book with me. It's actually downstairs in my dining room. I just realized that. So it is called Protocols in the Classroom. I just bought it on Amazon. I think it was like a $12 book maybe, and it has a handful of structures in there. They're not necessarily written for higher ed, but they're definitely usable in higher ed. I use them all the time. There's some different like text rendering activities and things like that. But that's where I got this microlab structure one from. And I love it. It's just a really great way, very similar to Jigsaw, but a little bit more structured. So the way this looks is we would put students in groups. I always do about 3 to 5, unless it's a partner activity. You'll provide a question, again, always having them independently respond to that prompt first. And then this is where this one's like really highly structured. So in their groups, they're going to number off 1, 2, 3, 4. Person number 1 gets a set amount of time of uninterrupted sharing time. Person 1 shares and only person 1 shares. Everybody else listens. Then it's followed by a short silent reflection time where the listeners, everybody else in the group, has to write down notes, questions, comments they're adding to their notes. Person number 2 shares for that same amount of uninterrupted sharing time, followed by the silent reflection, and that continues for the remaining students. At the end, then, you get this open discussion available for all students. So again, if we were together in the classroom, if we were in person, I would say, and again, we're not going to actually do this for the sake of time, but if we were together, I might have you think about a time you had really good engagement in a classroom you taught. What did you do to encourage the engagement among your students? What were what were they doing that you define as engaged? What learning opportunities resulted from this engagement? I'd give you 1 to 2 minutes to write about this, think about it, process it, jot down some notes. And then we would get into groups of, say, 4, and we would number off 1 through 4. Person 1's going to have 45 seconds to share. You have to use the full time. So if you get done and you have 12 seconds left, you got to find something else to add. Followed by 15 seconds of silent reflection, where everybody's going to add notes, questions, comments. And then we'll repeat with person 2, 3, and 4. Followed then by 2 to 3 minutes of open discussion. And then I'd have students return to their seats when they are prompted. So again, you could do this in an online format where you put students in groups of 4. And again, I was going to have people model this, but I'm looking at the time thinking I just need to keep going. In groups of 4 in breakout rooms, and say, okay, when you get into your breakout room, you're going to number off. And so pick one person who's going to be responsible for timekeeping, or maybe person number 1 goes first while person 2 time keeps. Then when person 2 shares, person 3 time keeps. Anything like that, so that everybody has their set time of uninterrupted sharing time, followed by that silent reflection. And then lastly, we can open it up for everybody to discuss. So I really love this one for a lot of different reasons. It is very highly structured, but it also works really well with a lot of different students. Our students who could easily monopolize the conversation, they get cut off at a certain point. Our students who might want to talk for 3 seconds and be like, I'm done, they have to fill that time. So sometimes it requires me to prompt them, okay, what else can you share? What other thoughts do you have? But they can usually do that. So if you're going to implement this, I always suggest decide what your time duration is beforehand, but then adjust it as needed. So I always have a visible timer first, but I always start with a really small amount of time early in the semester. Before students are comfortable with this, before they're comfortable with me and their peers, we start real small. So I might say you're just getting 30 seconds, because 30 seconds for students who don't like sharing in class is way less overwhelming and intimidating than you have 2 minutes to talk, or we're going to do this activity for 10 minutes. You have 30 seconds. And then sometimes I have a chattier group than I anticipate, and I'm having a hard time cutting them off at 30 seconds. And so I might say, okay, I'm going to extend it to 45. Okay. Other times I might have a really quiet class that I know I need to start super small. And I might start with, we're going to do 10 seconds and then, 20 seconds, 10's too fast, 20 seconds of sharing, 20 seconds silent reflection. And I might make that piece kind of even so that they have an equal amount of that talking time and that quiet time that feels a little bit more safe for them. And then I always require them to write down so that I can see, okay, you're writing down your thoughts first before you share. Then you've got something written down that you can physically look at while you're sharing out with your group. And then I want to see you taking notes as well. And I'll remind them, okay, 15 seconds of silent reflection time, add notes. What can you add? What do they have that you have questions about? What stuck out to you? What connected to something that you wrote? Did you think about something else? If you're person number 4, you might want to add something new, okay? And some ideas to implement this or when to use it. So anytime to debrief content. So similar to the turn and talk, I might give a prompt or a question that's about the content that we just covered. I want you to summarize this process. I just explained the process that the brain goes through when reading. It's a basic 4-step process, but I want you to explain it. I want you to summarize it with each 4 of the 4 steps. Okay. They might have the same question, right? So that everybody's sharing the same thing, but in doing so, their summaries get a little bit better. They hear, oh, I forgot that piece, or I thought it was this over here for step 3, but you said this, so we need to clarify. So all of them can kind of process that same information. Anytime I have a really large text, I might break it up for them to interpret it further. So for example, last fall in this class that's pretty heavily lecture based, we were doing a little bit of information with dyslexia, and I had kind of this it's almost like a brochure thing for teachers, what teachers need to know about dyslexia in the classroom, a very basic introduction level, but there's about 6 sections in it that are pretty heavy. So we read section 1 together, we went through it together, and then I had in groups of 5, each person was each group, was identified or required to do one section. So this group, you all are doing section number 1. Group 2, you're doing section number 2, and so forth. So they can dive into that content really deeply, but collectively together. It also really works if you have any sort of debate in your classroom, or you're going to engage in any sort of conversation that might be controversial or have like competing sides that might be potentially divisive in any ways, which is also very valuable for our students to have those conversations, again, in our classrooms and safe spaces. But the nice thing about this is, again, everybody has their uninterrupted sharing time, and then everybody has to listen. So it really works for anything where there might be sort of a debate or alternative perspectives, because you have to listen. You have to hear what everybody else is saying, and you don't get to interrupt them. But then you also get your uninterrupted sharing time. So that is the micro lab. Again, I really love it. I think it's a great strategy to utilize in the classroom. So the jigsaw, I'll go over a little faster because it looks like many of you are very familiar with it, but it is that idea where, and I'm just going to go right to this. Students start in one group, and each group has a different topic, a different question. But within that group, they're all looking at the same stuff. So for example, I've got in the pink group here, they might all be talking about chapter 1. Yellow group might be assigned chapter 2, orange group chapter 3, and then the blue group chapter 4. I always start with, again, that independent reflection first. You are going to write so that you have a response, so that you have some time to process that information, and then we will get together in your group and you're going to discuss it. So maybe the goal is that they're going to take away, or they're going to identify 5 key takeaways from the chapter, 3 ideas for implementation, and 1 lasting question. Maybe I structure it like that. So I usually provide some sort of direction. Again, unless I have a class that like they don't need that, which sometimes I get those classes within the teaching education department. But if I structure it highly, then everybody's got kind of like that goal. This is what we're identifying. So everybody comes together with their 5 key ideas, and then collectively as a group, we need to identify, what do we collectively see as those 5 key ideas? What do we collectively see as the 3 ideas for implementation? And lastly, what's one good, thoughtful question that we all agree on? So there's a little bit of consensus that's happening there, but everybody has to be engaged because you're going to become the master of your knowledge. So then on the right side of the screen, you can see what step 2 looks like. So now we're going to jigsaw those groups. So we're going to have one person from each of the original groups create a new group. So this is where, again, I use a deck of cards, like just a regular deck of cards all the time to do my groups. And I just pass them out. Sometimes I'll have intentional groups that I create. More often than not, though, I'm able to just pass out these cards and I have them kind of counted out for what I need. So I might give everybody a card and say, first, I want you to go with the same suit. So everybody that's a heart together, everybody that's a diamond together. So that's your first group. So that kind of shows that same color. Then I'll say, okay, we're going to jigsaw these groups. All of the 2s go together, all of the 3s, all the aces, and so forth. And then that's what you got over here on the right, is these new groups that have one person from each of the original groups that then they need to share out their information for the original group. So I'm the master of my knowledge for the pink group. I'm going to share that all with you. And then yellow group is the master of knowledge, or the yellow number 1 is the master of knowledge from the yellow group. They're going to share that out with all the other number 1s, and so forth. So it's a nice way to kind of break things up and kind of share some responsibility too. So again, in the classroom, if we were physically together, I might have you in colored groups and give each person or each group a different prompt to think about. So what are advantages of implementing cooperative learning into higher ed classrooms? What are the challenges of implementing cooperative learning? Will your students be receptive to engaging in cooperative learning in the classroom? Why or why not? And what 21st century skills do you believe are fostered through cooperative learning opportunities? So again, if we were physically together in the classroom, I'd put you in 4 groups, and each group would have a different prompt. You would write about it independently first. Then you'd go together with your group, discuss it, and come up with kind of that collective answer or summary for your group. And then we would jigsaw and create those new groups. And then same as kind of the last one, that micro lab, I always say, pay attention to that conversation, take notes, because you have to know what it is that you're saying, because you're not going to have a buddy with you to help you out. So write down what it is that you need to share out with your new group. So it's another strategy that kind of helps, again, some of those kind of more timid learners who aren't real quick to vocalize their thoughts and their learning in the classroom. They can kind of rely on everybody else first. Like, okay, this is what we're all collectively learning. I'm going to write down my notes so that then when I go to my new group, I've got all that information written down. So that's kind of the same idea with shifting those groups. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. I'm looking at the time. So again, some suggestions for implementation. Use some cards. You can either like type up something on, Word and boxes with colors and numbers, print them out, laminate them, chop them up. That's what I did with my elementary students. I still have them. They're shapes and colors, or just a regular deck of cards. I take it to every classroom with me, because sometimes halfway through I'm like, we need to mix up, or I need to throw something in because we need a little higher level of engagement. So I always have that deck of cards with me. Again, I say require or encourage that note taking. I always tell my students, you have to write it down. They might balk at it at first, but then they come to expect it. They know when I'm in Professor Shetler's classroom, like, yep, we're going to be writing. So I need to be here with a pencil and a piece of paper. And this one, again, it works well for breaking up large or intense sections of text. Instead of having everybody kind of decompress the whole text, let's divvy it up. Everybody gets different sections so that you can really focus on your section. And then collectively, we can get kind of the big ideas out of the whole thing. And then also kind of more in-depth processing of a specific component. So maybe I'm getting to the end of a unit and there was 6 major themes that we explored throughout that unit. Maybe each group has one of those themes and they're going to really kind of create a good summary of it. Or I have specific questions I want them to answer, specific prompts, anything like that, that then we can kind of bring it back together to that whole group when we mix up in that jigsaw. So the last one then is mix, pair, share. And again, it looks like a lot of you are familiar with this, very similar to turn and talk, except it's a little bit more continuous. So again, students stand up. I physically have them mix around the room. So some of my classrooms that I'm in allow a little bit more space than others for that, but I tell them, like, we're going to walk around, mix around the room. I'm going to tell you to pair up, and then I'm going to provide a prompt or a question where students are going to answer it together with their buddy. And again, I might, depending on my class, I might say, okay, the tallest person is going to go first today, the oldest person, the person who's standing closest to me, the person who's standing closest to the door, anything like that. Give them a little bit of time to talk. Again, when you have about 50 to 80% of those conversations really start to die down, wrap it all up, and then have them mix again. And then you can repeat this numerous times. You can also have students create questions. So this really works well for any sort of review session that you need to do. Have your students write those review questions, or if there's major components that you want students to know, here are your questions. So again, if you're in the classroom, some questions that I might have you mix up, pair up. The first question I might say is, in what ways has your knowledge of cooperative learning changed? Share with your buddy, thank your buddy. Okay, mix again. That next question is, what is one thing you will try to implement in your classroom? And again, we keep mixing up and then share again. So each time you can either give a new question or you can ask the same question because they're with a new person. Sometimes I do a little bit of both, depending on what my goal and my intention is in that time. So what does this one look like in an online format? I actually use this all the time when I'm teaching DL because it just really helps keep things at a fast pace and mixes it up. I call it a block party. I'm pretty sure I was in some sort of similar learning format where somebody called a similar thing block party. And I was like, I love the idea. It sounds like fun. I'm going to steal it. So I put students in breakout rooms, groups of 2, and I use the same thing with the timer. I'm going to set a 1-minute timer. So it's going to give you a 1-minute warning after your minute. So you'll have a total of 2 minutes in that room. Wait until it kicks you back. Don't leave the room early. Just wait until it kicks you back. I'll bring them all back. I'll say, okay, I'm going to mix you up again. And I send them right back out in those breakout rooms again. I just mix them up. They get 2 minutes. They come back. And depending on what it is that I'm having them discuss or what my questions prompts are for them, I might do it 3 to 4 times. I might do it even longer. I also like to do this at the beginning of a semester when I'm new to a group of students in an online format, where I'll just say, okay, I want you to share a little bit about yourself, because we don't get that same sort of connection online that we do in the classroom. And so it's just a fun way to do that. And that was the first time last semester that I did that. And I had so many students that were like, this is so awesome. I'm with these people online night after night, but sometimes I don't get to just chat with them about random things. Or I never talked to this individual person, and I got put in a breakout room with them, and it was really great. We learned that we have this thing in common. So you can not only use it for that content piece, but also for building relationships with and between your students in the classroom in that online format. I also use this all the time in my face-to-face classes at the beginning of the semester, just as some get to know you activities. So that's one suggestion I have too, is anytime you're going to introduce these to students for the first time, try to do it in a pretty low stakes environment first, where you're doing get to know you questions or anything like that, because then it just feels like a fun activity and it's not as stressful because it's not tied to content. So it's a little easier for students to engage. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up real quick here because I know I'm at my time. So again, we went through 4 strategies. Turn and talk, mix, pair, share are both low preparation strategies. Microlab and Jigsaw are a little higher preparation. And you'll see there's a variation of mixed pair share called quiz, quiz, trade. Very similar, but each student has an actual card or post-it, whatever you want, with a question on it. Again, either you come up with those questions or they write the questions. They buddy up. Each person asks their question and answers it. Then they switch cards. So now I have a new question. I'm going to find a new buddy, and it's just a continuous cycle that doesn't require you to kind of direct students when to switch. They just keep going, answer as many questions as you can. Okay, so lastly, some general suggestions I have. Start with one and get good at it. If you're good at it, what can you add to it, or what's something else you can add in that's a new strategy? Always review those cooperative learning engagement expectations before grouping students. So before I get them in groups, I always say, okay, here's the process that we're going to go through. And I'm also very explicit with my expectations. This is what I'm looking for. Your phones are put away. You don't need your phone at this time. Please put it in your bag. You need to bring your paper, your pencil. I want to see you looking and listening. I want to hear you engaged. If it's a microlab, remember, you have 45 seconds. You need to fill that whole time. So really go through those expectations very clearly so that it really limits some of the issues that could potentially come up that kind of impacts that engagement. Number 4, I think, is really important. Engage with the groups. Is really, this is not a time where you get them going and you sit back and check your email, but rather you're really engaging with them, because you can help the conversations move forward, but also it provides incredible feedback for you on how students are understanding the content. When I listen in on those different groups, I can hear what we're learning, what we know, any misconceptions that I hear. There's been times where we're 2 minutes into what might be a 10-minute cooperative learning structure, and I stop the whole class and say, I realize I was unclear with something. Let me provide clarity, and then I'm going to re-engage you in your groups. And then vary those selections, or those group selections. Sometimes I pick, sometimes I let them pick. Sometimes they're homogeneous groups, sometimes they're heterogeneous groupings. So for example, one class I teach, classroom management, is elementary and secondary students, so students who want to teach high school. Sometimes I mix them all up because that's valuable. Other times I say, okay, I want all of you that are elementary to go together. If you're going to be high school science, go together, high school PE. And then lastly, use that deck of cards because it works really, really well for grouping students. Super easy, pretty cheap. And then you don't have to worry about that issue of like, oh, I always get put with this person. It's the luck of the draw. Okay, so I feel like I really flew through those last few pieces really quickly. I do want to open it up for any questions. I also have a QR code there. You're welcome to scan that. It'll just take you to a little handout document that I've created in the last couple of years. And I tend to add to it here and there. And it just has a lot of these structures. And I think I have a couple others on there as well, just something that I created to share with colleagues. So, that was really fast to finish up. Any questions for me? Awesome. That's great to hear, Elena. And definitely feel free to share that document that's linked there as well as just a quick handout with some resources.
Man, that was great. I actually learned stuff.
Awesome. It's like no matter how much I time these things out, I could talk about cooperative learning forever. And all of a sudden I'm like, I gotta pick up the pace. Time always goes fast when you're doing fun things. So
Yeah, I get the impression you enjoy what you do.
I do. I do. Like I said, if my daughter is like, what else would you do? I don't know what I would do. So teaching is very much my passion and my joy. So
Yeah, tell. Well, I'm gonna